Hi, everyone. Today I'm excited to have Milind with me. Milind is a quality and compliance leader with decades of experience across pharmaceuticals, biotechnology, medical devices, and clinical research. Having served in senior auditing, compliance, and advisory roles with organizations including BMS and Eli Lilly, he founded RiverArk, a global quality consulting firm that provides comprehensive services in GXP domain. And today on Prorian, he brings a rare perspective on how regulatory expectations are transformed into inspection-ready operational reality. So welcome, Milind.
Indeed, Jacob. It is a pleasure to be here. And of course, as you said, there's that wonderful overlap between QA and RA is what we decided we'll be talking about. Let's see how it leads, though.
Sure. I'm excited about that. So let me begin by sharing an observation from my own experience, okay? Organizations often tend to speak about regulatory affairs and quality assurance as though they occupy separate domains. Regulatory is viewed as a function that engages health authorities, drives approvals, while quality is seen as a function that's responsible for compliance and internal controls. Yet when I look at the major challenges that organizations face, whether it's delayed filing or a significant variation, inspection finding, or a remediation program, the root cause rarely sits entirely within one function. More often, what we see is a breakdown somewhere is in the handoff between interpretation and execution. I can see that you're nodding and agreeing to that. So regulatory may understand what authority expects, but quality determines whether the organization can consistently demonstrate it, right? And conversely, quality may build robust systems, but regulatory often has to explain and defend those systems externally. So I sometimes wonder whether the distinction between regulatory and quality is actually a functional distinction, or it's simply two perspectives on the same regulatory obligation. So I just want to check from your perspective, let's begin with that. Is the traditional view of regulatory being externally focused and quality being internally focused still useful, or have we outgrown that distinction? Is it accurate or too simplistic?
Wonderful. Actually, it's a useful shorthand, let's put it that way, to begin with. But the moment you rely on it as a management principle, that's when the trouble begins. So let me break it down. I mean, having spent about 25 odd years now around GXP inspections, and I can tell you that organizations that treat RA and QA as two sides of the wall, if I may, are the ones that end up with the most painful inspection findings. And perhaps a story that will be useful for you. This is everyday life for me, so hence a story always makes more sense. We were involved in an inspection readiness review at a mid-sized biotech at one point in time. The regulatory team had filed a clean IND amendment. The data looked really strong, but when the inspector started looking at the reviews and asked for the CAPAs raised for safety signals that underpinned that amendment, there was kind of no adequate response that came from the team. The CAPA was in a different system. It was under different ownership, and the whole ownership trail was not very clear and had not been formally closed. That was the regulatory story on the other side. When they made the submission, it was impeccable. The quality evidence definitely had a gap. That's where this is where I'm coming. This is the real answer to your question, actually. Regulatory affairs reads the landscape, translate the expectations, and in an outwardly facing fashion. Whereas on the other hand, quality operationalizes those expectations inside the organization and inward facing. But those two directions must converge on exactly the same evidence. They can't be going in different directions. They have a shared destination, essentially. So, RA professionals must understand the quality systems, QA must understand what regulatory review is, and so on and so forth. That's the best way of putting it. I think the best practitioners are the ones that I know who are fluent in both the language, quality and regulatory.
But traditionally, can you speak a little bit from your observation where the friction points are commonly seen between RA and QA? We understand there's the interpretation gaps, but when it comes to real world scenarios where there's timing pressure or where sometimes they believe there's probably not over compliance, but focusing more than required or overdoing it in terms of compliance. there is no strategic flexibility, and such type of friction areas have you come across?
Not having a strategy doesn't definitely help, so that's a clear problem scenario. But the frictions could occur because of multiple reasons, both these groups, if I may, and I'm calling them out separately purely because they need to have a single destination, like I said earlier. The regulatory folks, and both you and I have worked in the regulatory world, we have seen these new regulations, new piece of legislation come up. We need to look at that and interpret it and bring it back into the organization. We are kind of the organization's translators for that regulation piece. Whereas when we give it to our quality folks, our quality friends, they take it and start looking at it from a perspective of how this is going to impact our organization. What are the processes that are going to be affected? Are we going to be affected at all or not? So they start from that prerogative, and then as they distill it down and then they find out what is it that they need to change, then it becomes a smooth affair after that. Whereas if there is a top-down push, I'm just going to use a very high-level example. ICH E6 R3 has come into force, and everybody is doing R3 style trials.
Right.
It has been pushed down and said that, you've got to implement, you've got to do this. This is the implementation date for these regions, and so on and so forth. The quality team members are the ones who are going to look at it and operationalize this within the GCP operations across the globe where the impact is. But it's a global world, so they can't do one thing for one region at this time and then another thing for another region. So that is where that whole strategy comes into place. So where frictions could occur, where they think, okay, the US is not asking for it right now. It's only Europe. Let's work with Europe, or things like that might become a little bit dicey. So the not having a strategy, like I said, won't help. It's almost like it's a relay race. I compare it to a relay race. It's not like you're running to a finish. It's a constant thing. You are passing the baton on. And that baton zone, the transition point, as I would call it, is important. That's where most organizations might drop it. And that's your friction point, where it's a smooth transition between A to B, B to C, and so on. Whether it is not just quality regulatory, but everything else within operations, everything else within quality management systems, and all the associated, framework around it.
In fact, you raised a great example. That journey from a submission story to inspection reality is something that's so core to an organization's compliance rigor. Regulatory professionals naturally spend enormous effort on the submission itself. We focus on strategy, evidence generation, dossier quality, agency interactions, ultimately seeking approval. But over time, I've come to appreciate that approval is not necessarily the ultimate test of an organization's regulatory maturity. The real test often comes later, when an inspector walks in and asks a simple question: show me the evidence behind what you've told us in your CMC dossier, let's say, through the manufacturing side. At that point, the discussion shifts from scientific justification to operational credibility. In many ways, a submission represents what the company says about itself, right? Like when an inspection happens, it evaluates whether the organization can consistently prove it. That's why QA prepares the system, RA defends it externally.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that framing. I just would like to add one more thing to it. That they would be much better if they are prepared together. Essentially, that's what I would like to latch on to that. So QA preparing the system, RA defending it externally, but being prepared together. That's probably the key. So when an FDA inspector sits across from your regulatory team in a backroom meeting and asks very pointed questions of your risk categorization approach for an investigational product, for example, that's an RA moment. That's where they voice the interpreter, the strategic defender, the RA then talks through all of this. But they can only defend what actually exists. If there is nothing in the background, it'll all fall apart, and what actually exists is built by quality. The SOPs, the training records, deviation history, the evidence, that piece, the deviation history, have you done all your CAPA closures, all of that stuff, So the audit trail and the integrity of it all, all of that, if you're able to have everything in one place and it can be defended nicely, and the RA person is well equipped. If there are gaps in the system, if there is anything that is not adequate, then no amount of articulate the best RA person that you have in the back room can save you. Basically, that's what I would say. So Maybe if we have time for just one quick example that comes to my mind, when we were looking at a joint FDA MHRA parallel assessment, two separate agencies, two inspection teams, same organization, the RA team gave a wonderful masterclass style opening presentation. The QARA vice president did a fantastic job within 8 minutes or something like that. Very clear structure, confident. Then the inspection team started looking at the documents, and then they found a validation gap. A system that had been live for nearly maybe about 24 months or so without a formal assessment, a formal revalidation where it was required once there was a significant upgrade. And although it was known within the CSV team of that at that point of time, it did not actually translate into what we would have seen as a formal escalation essentially within the organization, and hence the leadership did not know.
Yeah, so this happens all the time.
Absolutely, and they couldn't defend it, and that everything fell apart. So that's what I'm saying. QA really has to have all that at the back room, which makes RA look good. So it's like almost one team makes the other team looks good, but they have to work together. Just bringing that point home again. I hope that helps.
I don't know if this question is a reasonable one, but in your experience, have you seen difference between gaps that occur in large pharma or big pharma versus mid-size and small? Of course, you have different sort of quality gaps: missing documentation, traceability, delayed CAPAs, incomplete justification. Do you see anything weighing heavily for big pharma versus smaller mid-sized pharma?
This is something I actually presented at a conference literally this Monday as well. And there's a bunch of young biotech CEOs I was presenting to. It was a conference wherein they were trying to understand how compliance affects all the aspects of their work that they are doing. These are CSOs, CEOs of companies that did not know what quality and compliance was, but they were there listening and getting educated. At that point of time, to make it very basic, I broke it down to the point where I said that inspection and registration of your product is a big milestone that you want, because that's your commercial strategy. You're a commercial organization. At the end of the day, you want to do business. So registration of your product is big. So for the registration to happen, you need to have a submission. And in between these two is an inspection. So with all of this comes in that data which tells you where people are going wrong or where people are going right. So I just put together some data that I pulled from FDA 483's MHRA inspection database and EMA inspection database. And the best part of all of this is available in public domain. We can all access it. And we kind of did an assessment of it, came up with the fact that QMS and quality systems and process related observations were the highest on all the three agency radar, no matter what kind of company it is, whether it is a small biotech, which is seven people organization, depending on all outsourced activity, or a big pharma. Quality systems not working is the biggest thing. So when we think we are working in a world where we are affecting patient safety and all of that, we need to have a process so strong. That's where we are failing. And that's what the regulators are telling us. Other things, like you said, the missing documentation, delayed CAPAs, incomplete justification of activities, traceability aspects, and so on. There are, I'm not saying they're not there, but when you look at these gaps, they're almost never what the organization thinks that the gaps are. The teams prepare for the big obvious ones, and then they get caught out on the connective tissue, literally on the connective tissue. So again, that is the data piece of it. And from a personal perspective, whenever we have helped quite a few organizations work through getting themselves ready for inspection. So inspection readiness, inspection preparedness, that mock inspection. So using ex-agency folks who really know what might be checked, what might not be checked, what questions will be asked, and such. So we've done those exercises quite a lot. And we have seen that of late, the lean is more on the systems, the electronic systems that are being, be it for clinical, be it for, if it's an EBMR you're using, it's in the manufacturing, it's that they're focusing on. They're looking for data integrity trails. The most important thing that they're looking for is traceability. Whatever you're doing, is it traceable? That's the first. Organizations produce good data. The clinical results should be solid. The safety narrative should be coherent. The manufacturing controls should be documented. That's what they want. That whole traceability, the ability to follow any data point all the way from the raw data, let's say, up to the point where it has been quoted in a submission. So that whole traceability, that's what they're following. FDA is big on traceability. Right. They look for data traceability all the time. So that's the second answer that I would like to say. So, although very we have important. QMS on one side, we have traceability, which is a big deal on the other side.
I wanted to flip the question, and this is so interesting as I hear you speak from direct experience. I'm wondering whether you have come across examples where the documentation is strong, but it still failed regulatory scrutiny. Like, we don't know, based on sometimes a wrong understanding, and then you have very robust document. I'm just wondering whether there are examples like that.
Quite a few, actually. Okay. So appearance and reality is what we call it, and it's a very consultant speak. That's what I've been living all my life right now. So appearance and reality, that gap is exactly what most experienced inspectors are trained to expose. So that's what we keep telling. Appearance and reality are things that you need to focus on. A compliant looking dossier has all the sections. It uses the right format. It's clean. It's professional. It's very structured. The inspection ready dossier has that you think what it should have. The story is consistent. So that's what that appearance piece that I was talking about. But when I conduct, let's say, a mock GCP inspection, I always do something very simple. I pick a specific finding from a study history, say a protocol deviation that involved the incorrect dosing, perhaps in 3 subjects. The one that comes to my mind, which I'm looking at, I find that in the dossier, then I find it in the CSR, then I find it in the deviation form, and then the trial master file. Then I ask the clinical monitors or the clinical monitoring managers what they remember about it. Then I ask the site coordinators if they know anything about it. And if all the story matches with the same dates, the same root cause, the same corrective actions, all the document is telling the same story as what all these people are telling, then they're inspection ready. If they are not, if the story shifts between sources, the dossier may look perfect, but you might have a problem.
Documentation doesn't matter. Yeah.
And also, the dossier piece will be only one part of it. There's all of this. I bring it back to the first thing what you said, evidence. All of the evidence is sitting in multiple places. And all that what I mentioned, where the CAPA is, where the deviation has been recorded, where the CAPA has been recorded, whether all of those have been trickled down to the site, back to the site where it needs to. Has that been communicated to the CRO if the CRO is involved? All of those pieces have to fall together. If they don't, if that story is not coherent, no, it doesn't work. So that's what it is about, appearance and reality. The appearance on the paper, it will look, oh, wonderful. We had a CAPA raised, it was closed on such and such a date, and that's it. It was all fantastic. You reported it to the ethics, you reported it to the regulators, we are good. But when they do the data trail, if it doesn't hold up, that's where the gap is. So maybe just a quick thing on that. Compliance, when you look at it overall, compliance, when you think about it, it's a document position. Inspection readiness is an organizational position.
Yes.
And you can't fake that later.
No.
So you can't fake it at all. Or both of these have to be very coherent, very together.
Yes. No, that is so real. That is true. And I think as teams, what I'm hearing again and again is not just being able to agree on your communication, on your documents and what is spoken about, but you need to agree on what you think as a team and what you understand as a team, right? Milind, that's very real. And I think the message is that it's not how we look on paper, it's how we come across as a team who has a uniform understanding and have the same interpretation and work coherently and talk cohesively, I think. Yeah. So going on to actual situations where we have issues, okay? Regulatory teams tend to focus on visible events like submissions, approvals, commitments, questions from authorities, inspections. Yet, many of the issues don't begin as a regulatory issue at all. They begin probably as a deviation that wasn't fully investigated or a recurring quality event that has become normalized. A CAPA that closed administratively but not effectively, or a trend that nobody connected across functions maybe. So by the time regulators become interested, the problem has often existed for months or years inside the quality system. So I mean, in other words, the regulatory consequence frequently appears much later than the operational signal that we may have missed. So, organizations managing CAPAs as a documentation exercise, when they should perhaps have viewed it as a signal or an early indicator of a future regulatory risk, is what I'm thinking. So from an auditor's perspective, what do regulatory teams most commonly underestimate about deviations and CAPAs, maybe?
The very first thing we started off talking about regulatory and quality being the two sides of a wall, how
Yes.
organizations. When you think of that scenario, then yes, clearly, because regulatory affairs will not have complete visibility to what is going on with all the CAPAs that have occurred for this particular program or this submission that you're dealing with, for example. Rightfully so in one way, because they are not the experts. They're not the ones who are dealing with the CAPA, unless it's their own process system CAPA that they're dealing with. They will not have the absolute detail, the granular detail of what would have gone wrong in those. Doesn't mean that they don't have to know that. It's something that is an asset if they know it, if you ask me. In my personal experience, a good regulate scientist, good regulate team member would be the one who would have a handle on what CAPAs are going on and what deviations have occurred for the project that they are actually handling the submission for. It's a good idea to look through those parts and understand if there is enough evidence in that. I mean, I'm one of those, as they would call, a left-wing quality person, although I'm not left-wing by any means in my political inclinations.
But in quality.
But in quality, I would rather be left wing than right wing, because right wing only gets you into trouble. Being conservative helps, but being conservative with a risk-based element helps you a lot more. And that's what regulatory affairs should also be looking at it from the other side, being that be risk-based about what you want to know more about. Is your CMC shaky? Focus on CMC. Is your clinical shaky? Focus on clinical. That's the call you got to make it. I'm making it sound very very generalistic in that sense, but you know what I'm talking about. Go down specific within that where problem area lies, whether it is a CRO, whether it is a CDMO, whether it is our internal teams not addressing things. What is it that you got to be aware of? So focus on that, please. Yes. I hope I've managed to answer that.
You've emphasized it so well that it's highlighted. To me, the message is very clear. I think leadership should view risk management as what needs to be focused rather than issue management. So you don't manage issues later if you are focused on managing risk. This is interesting. No discussion in today's world is complete without looking at digital systems, AI, and compliance, right? So we've spoken about this earlier, that digital systems, electronic records are becoming increasingly critical.
Yeah.
Milind, in today's world, no discussion is complete without addressing digital systems, AI, and compliance, and the future of compliance. We did talk that digital systems and electronic controls are becoming increasingly critical. At the foundation of it, though, data integrity is one of those topics that has been discussed extensively, yet it continues to appear in inspection findings around the world. And what's interesting is that the underlying principles themselves are not particularly new. Concepts such as attributable ownership, auditability, traceability, which you spoke about, have existed for a long time. What has changed is the degree to which organizations now depend on digital systems and interconnected data flows, right? So increasingly regulators are not simply assessing whether data exists, they are assessing whether they can trust the decisions that were based on this data. So when we talk about product quality, patient safety, clinical evidence, or PV, pharmacovigilance, we are ultimately talking about trust in the information. So what do you think? Data integrity, does it remain such a persistent challenge despite industry's awareness of it in today's world?
Let's look at it from the regulators or competent authorities perspective. So the regulatory framework has moved from trusting paper audit trails to now they're interrogating electronic systems. Although they have the same goal, but then they are not the same discipline when you think about it. Because paper audit trails. So, but I'm sure you agree with this. When we started in the industry, a GMP audit actually meant reviewing batch records, which were paper logbooks, physical filing systems, and whatnot. So I don't know if you recall when we would get those bunch of documents from those manufacturing sites from those different places. We would look at the data ourselves and is this submission worthy, not submission worthy. We would take a call on the box files. Everything was paper based from that perspective. But now it has changed significantly. The audit trail is electronic, the documentation is electronic, and this kind of fundamentally changes what you're looking for in terms of the compliance equation. Okay.
True. True.
Even things such as SOPs were in binders, if I remember, for a long period of time. And now we have an EQMS that holds your deviation history, your training records. We would actually call for deviation records, and that would arrive by photocopies, and photocopies of documents would arrive and sit on our desk, and we would look at it. I'm now being nostalgic, but
Yes.
so things have changed on the other side as well. When the regulators are looking at it, and this is something that I've heard many times over the last 4 different conferences that I've attended, where US FDA directors, the director of BIMO, Dr. Cochran, she made this comment about the use of technology, the extended use of technology within the regulators has increased as well. They have their own AI agent called ELSA as well, which helps them in review, their own AI machinery, which tells them how to prep for the inspection, what to do. The whole thing has gone electronic in many ways, and these are the reality of today. When you look at a commercial organization now, what we used to do as folders and ECTD when it came, I remember the first few days when we started working with the XML structure and trying to put things together. Now we have a whole regulatory intelligence management system, or regulatory intelligence systems, which everything is within the electronic system, the regulatory information systems, and so on. Yeah. So the RIMS, as they call it. Yeah. So everything, including the data creation, data analysis, and data submission, everything is gone electronic. So there is no getting away from it, firstly. And secondly, when you are doing everything in this modality, the expectation from the competence authority has not changed. They still expect traceability. They still expect integrity at all steps. They still expect, is it Milind who has done this? Is it Jacob who has approved this?
Accountability.
Are we able to prove it? Whole Alcoa business, whether it is a simple approval that you're doing, or whether it is a detailed analysis, a very complex thing that you're putting together and writing a summary, all of that becomes very important in this electronic world. So the question is no longer whether these systems are validated. The question is how the governance, the architecture is around them. What is the one thing that is connecting them? And in my experience, I have looked at organizations with usually well-developed validation systems that are at enterprise level, that are architecturally completely disconnected from one another, and that doesn't help. So that perhaps is the place where you're looking at. FDA and MHRA are both increasing their focus on electronic record governance, and it's a very distinct inspection domain activity for them when they come down. The recent FDA data integrity guidance update is kind of highlighting specifically on that. MHRA has put together guidances, EMA has put together guidances. They all tell a consistent story of what electronic systems are creating, new forms of compliance risk that organizations have not fully kind of understood, internalized it, and responded to, basically. So that's why you're getting more and more of these guidance documents from these regulators. It's kind of hinting towards the fact that they know not everybody is picking up, and here's the helping hand we're going to give you how to pick up.
Yes. Absolutely. You hit the point, because throughout the industry's digital transformation journey, the relationship between regulatory and quality has been pretty well understood. Regulatory focused on using the systems to manage submissions, registrations, labeling, health authority, and quality focused on validating those systems, ensuring that they remain compliant. But as we go forward with the advent of AI, we are beginning to probably nervously wait as organizations are deploying technologies, or will begin deploying technologies, that do not simply store information but actively participate in the workflow, generating, summarizing, prioritizing, sometimes even recommending decisions. We don't know. Now that will change the conversation significantly, because regulatory teams are seeing tremendous potential in terms of authoring support, regulatory intelligence, life cycle planning. At the same time, quality teams are being asked difficult questions around validation, explainability, accountability, change control. It feels as though both functions are now entering a territory where neither side has a complete playbook. So
it's It's an inflection point, as most business folk would like to call it. It's a very amazing point in time of how we are looking at and interacting with things. So it kind of introduces this particular tension, if I may. Quality non-regulatory affairs has existing frameworks and to fully resolve this. This is where definitely there's a gap, there's a risk that still sits. The traditional validation does not work. It doesn't work because traditional validation works for that are not evolving continuously. There is this whole thing, why are you using an electronic system? What are you validating for? When you just look at the answer for that basic question, it says this electronic system is supposed to do this activity, and we have validated it several times, tested it multiple ways to tell you that it is going to do this every single time the same way. The product. So here, when you bring the AI in the mix, the general understanding is that the AI gets better with usage. I mean, that's the general perception. That's how technology has been sold to the general public. And that's fair. It's an amazing invention. It is a next level of automation wherein the system is clever enough to understand what the need of the user is and start building buildings upon that, stacking things one on top of that. And if you have asked I mean, most of us have been using AI for fun. At least I use it for fun. Just to give you an example, the other day I was actually asking one of the AIs, none of these AIs are paying me anything, so I'm not going to take anybody's name, but one of them, I asked them a question, very simple one. How would Winston Churchill approach this problem? And it was amazing. The context that it gave was so crisp and so clear in terms of how a wartime prime minister would actually kind of approach it. The same question I said, how would Mahatma Gandhi approach it? And that was a totally different one. Wow. And I said, I've been reading a little bit of philosophy myself, so I've been fascinated by how Professor Kant approaches certain things in life. And how that came about was because I was looking at how does ethics work in the clinical trials? We have an ethics committee, we hold and all of that. And so I went and asked, what do Professor Kant think about conducting double-blinded clinical trials? And the answer I got was actually so thoughtful. It made me think on several angles, and I said, oh my God, this is good for such stuff, but for work, it's probably not, ready yet, because we are answering very specific questions, and we are trained as scientists within the pharmaceutical, biotechnology, medical device world in a certain fashion. We have to stay in our lane when we are doing certain things. We can leave a lane. I'm not saying we can't, but you have to explain why you left a lane and what is it there in the other lane that you're doing and coming back into this lane. So if this is not mad science we are talking about. We're talking about controlled science essentially, and everything that is reproducible, everything that can be substantiated, everything that can be evidenced, and so on. So with these AI systems trying to learn things, trying to do things better, it becomes a little dodgy territory. The more it learns, the more better it gets, or worse it gets, or hallucinates, or whatever. So if systems are controlled in a way specific to tell us that this is a controlled system, and when I ask this question, it's going to give you a consistent reply every single time, then yes, you can prove it. But if it learns and if it does something else, it's different. Again, another example from FDA. FDA's ELSA. And this was what was presented at the conference in November last year. What the director of BIMO said was that they use ELSA, and then ELSA actually went and found a question was asked. ELSA threw up something and prepared a whole legal document using that, saying here is a new regulation that you can bring about for this. And the basis for this is all of these different that it brought in from the database of FDA. So turns out that it had picked on the main basis of preparing that legislation was a draft document that hadn't even gotten reviewed, that hadn't even gotten approved. So it was basing a new legislation on a draft legislation which was not approved, thinking that it is approved. So it is not that intelligent, the AI itself on its own, that it can give you a good output. So this was an example from FDA, which was says so ELSA doesn't know everything, saying you can trust an AI, but within parameters, and that's why the human in loop becomes so much more important. So when you look at trying to bringing AI into our quality and regulatory work, we work best within frameworks. Our quality folks and regulatory folks work best within frameworks. If we give us lane, and my example of lanes, if you give us lane, we'll work within that lane. We'll be happy going in that lane. If you give us an open field to play with, it's a little difficult because we know the folks that we are working with are not good enough to be controlled within that working field. So it is that matter of giving that control framework that would help.
Truly spoken like a left-wing quality expert. But, seriously, I think as we speak, it's so important to remember that the direction in which we are heading is that, at least in the past, our history has been compliance-driven quality. And like you said, after digital transformation, we did have very clear rules that were followed: installation qualification, operational qualification. But now, with the advent of AI, since we don't have a playbook on what it's going to do and how it's going to deliver, it will force us to rethink how we approach quality. It's not going to be as simple or as black and white. And so we need to go upstream, and it'll be more intelligence driven quality, more atomic on a continuous basis. We are moving to a world where real time compliance will also be required. It's not going to be at a point after in the future. This was an excellent discussion, Milind. Thanks so much for patiently going through these questions.
It is the real world that we are living in. Although we work within the frameworks, like I said, the challenges are not framed. The challenges and the solutions to those challenges need to come within the framework that we are going to work with. So happy to be part of this conversation. I know some of it, it's almost like we'll not be able to solve all the problems within one day, but at least we will be able to discuss and understand where everybody else is at in those scenarios. What makes it better for me when I look at it and talk to different professionals and different members of the fraternity, if I may, all of us are swimming in the same sea, and all of us are facing same waves and same tides. So it means how easily we are able to adapt to it, and how quickly we are able to turn this around and make it a smooth ride for us. And so that perhaps those are my closing points, I would say, for this one now.
Thank you. That really helps bring together our discussion. And my main objective was that when talking to you, I wanted to clarify for myself the question about the role of regulatory, the role of quality, how it seemed like they are parallel, but they're actually converging and they're together. And the issue is not issue management, it is risk management. So thanks for going through this discussion, the points, and very interesting examples that you shared. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Jake.
Thank you, Milind.